An asymmetric war system. Missiles that can strike U.S. bases across the region. Drones that can overwhelm air defenses. Fast naval units designed to disrupt shipping lanes. And networks of allied groups across multiple countries. Each of these tools is relatively cheap, but together they create constant pressure. And more importantly, they force the United States to respond using extremely expensive systems. A $30,000 drone can trigger a $3 million interceptor. A swarm of low-cost attacks can drain billions over time. And that imbalance doesn't show up in one battle. It shows up over months and years. This is not about one strike. It's about sustaining the war, because the longer this conflict continues, the more it stretches across multiple fronts. Iran, Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, the Red Sea, and every new front increases the cost, which leads to the most dangerous question of all. What happens if air power isn't enough? Because if strikes and missile campaigns fail to decisively weaken Iran, there's only one option left: ground forces. And this is where the options stop being good and start becoming dangerous. Because once a war reaches this point, the choices don't get easier, they get riskier. A ground invasion would be slow, costly, and unpredictable. The alternative is escalation. Deeper strikes, hardened underground targets, critical infrastructure. And if this war keeps widening, that could eventually include facilities tied to Iran's nuclear program. Because if conventional pressure fails, the targets only get more sensitive. Even global institutions have started warning about escalation. Because once a war reaches this stage, it becomes harder to contain. And as escalation increases, the margin for error disappears. Because in conflicts like this, the biggest danger isn't always what's planned. It's what happens when control starts slipping. And this is where wars stop being quick and start becoming harder to control. A ground invasion of Iran would be one of the largest military operations in modern history. The terrain would slow any advance. Supply lines would stretch across hostile environments. And even if initial objectives were achieved, holding territory would be an entirely different challenge. It could require hundreds of thousands of troops, years of sustained presence, and constant resistance. This is exactly what Iran is trying to force. Because once the war reaches that stage, it's no longer about military strength. It's about endurance, economic endurance, political endurance, and public tolerance for a long war. And this is where the real risk begins. Not that the United States is weaker, but the war itself becomes harder to control. Because every escalation creates new consequences. Oil markets react, allies feel pressure, regional instability spreads, and a list of acceptable targets starts getting shorter and more dangerous. At that point, winning becomes less about defeating Iran and more about whether the United States can sustain the conflict long enough to achieve its goals. The United States still has overwhelming military advantages. Its technology is unmatched. Its global reach is unmatched. Its alliances are powerful. But modern wars aren't decided by strength alone. They're decided by whether that strength can be sustained, over time, over pressure, and across multiple fronts. Iran understands this. It knows it can't outspend the US, but it doesn't need to. Because if the war becomes long enough, expensive enough, and complex enough, even the strongest military in the world can find itself fighting a conflict that becomes harder and harder to finish. And that is how wars are lost. Not always by defeat on the battlefield, but by being pulled into a war that was never meant to be won quickly. Because in modern warfare, you don't always lose by being weaker. Sometimes, you lose by fighting the wrong kind of war.